Content on this podcast may contain elements that are not suitable for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to episode 7 of The Crime Shack. This episode is going to be a multi-part episode because there is so much information in this particular case. This could be a serial podcast on its own as it's that crazy and convoluted. Be sure to head over to thecrimeshack.com for all available episodes and show notes, and also like and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. On April 21st and 22nd of 2016, 8 people, members of the Rhoden and Gilley families, were murdered presumably in the middle of the night or early morning in Pike County, Ohio. The Rhoden and Gilley families were a close-knit group who would raise fighting roosters, breed dogs, and salvage cars for sales. They would often participate in local community pastimes like the demolition derby and four-wheeling. The county where the Rhoden and Gilley families lived was Pike County, Ohio, which is situated in the southern portion of Ohio. It includes small-town communities, and the population in 2010 in the entire county was around 29,000 people. That was 10 years ago, of course. I'm sure it has an increased population today. Pike County lies in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, is about 80 miles east of Cincinnati, and is best known for the uranium enrichment plant located in the town of Piketon, which is one of only 3 such plants in the United States. If you pull up a Google satellite map of Pike County, Ohio, this will give you a pretty clear picture of just how rural this community is. Lots of land with small houses sprinkled throughout. Piketon County is surrounded by Pike Lake State Park, Pike Lake State Forest, and the Scioto Trail State Forest, which provides the residents with thousands of acres of forest lands to go hiking, fishing, biking, camping, and hunting. For being such a small community, Pike County does its best to include festivals and fairs for families to enjoy throughout the year. The Pike County Fair usually runs in July and August, and the Pike County Dogwood Festival, which celebrates the legend of the dogwood tree, is usually held in April. Pike County is one of those tight-knit communities where just about everyone knows each other, and the victims in this case were no exception. They were a large, well-known family within the community. As most of the general public, I first heard about this case on the news at the time it happened, and I remember thinking, wow, 8 people murdered. Who could possibly have planned to do something like that except some kind of gang or organized crime syndicate? What would be a compelling reason to murder multiple people, let alone an entire family in the middle of rural Ohio? The 8 victims were all in some way related to one another. They were not all living in the same home at the time of the murders, but were spread out among 4 different properties in the towns of Piketon and neighboring Rhoden, Ohio. 7 of the victims were killed in 3 separate trailers on the same rural property, and the 8th victim occupied a separate trailer about 6 miles away. Most of the victims appeared to have been sleeping at the time they were shot. The victims were Christopher Rhoden Sr., 40 years old, Dana Lynn Rhoden, 37 years old, who was the ex-wife of Christopher Rhoden Sr., Christopher Rhoden Jr., 16 years old, who was the youngest son of Dana and Christopher Rhoden Sr., Hannah Mae Rhoden, 19 years old, who was the daughter of Dana and Christopher Rhoden, Clarence Frankie Rhoden, 20 years old, who was the oldest son of Dana and Christopher Rhoden, Hannah Hazel Gilley, 20 years old, who was the fiancée of Frankie Rhoden, Kenneth Rhoden, 44 years old, who was the brother of Christopher Rhoden Sr., and Gary Rhoden, 38 years old, who was the cousin of Chris Rhoden Sr. and Kenneth Rhoden. On April 22nd, 2 911 calls were placed from the properties of the victims. The first 911 call was made at 7:49 a.m. by Bobby Jo Manley, the younger sister to Dana Rhoden. Bobby would stop by her sister and former brother-in-law's property on Union Hill Road in Piketon each morning to feed their dogs and chickens. When Bobby arrived on the property, she first attempted to enter the home of Christopher Rhoden Sr. and Gary Rhoden, Chris's cousin, who also lived in the home. but noticed that the door was locked. She had a key, so she let herself in, which is interesting to note because whoever had committed the murders had made sure to lock the doors on their way out. That's when Bobby discovered both Christopher Sr. and Gary Rhoden lying on the floor, dead in the back bedrooms. She explains to the 911 operator that there is blood all over the house, and it appears that, in her words, someone beat the crap out of them. She is understandably distraught and out of breath during the 911 call.
911. Yes, I need to get the 40. Let's go. Hold on.
I need you to tell me the address. What's the address?
Just a second. We walked to the mailbox. I think my brother-in-law's dead.
Okay, what's the address?
Give me just a second. 4077 Union Hill Road.
4077.
4077.
Okay, 4077 Union Hill, correct?
Yes, 4077 Union Hill Road.
Ma'am, you gotta tell me what's going on.
There's blood all over the house.
Okay.
My brother-in-law's in the bedroom. It looks like someone has beat the hell out of him.
Okay.
There's blood all over the front room.
Ma'am, can you tell me what county that's in? Is it
Pike County?
It's Pike County?
Yes, and they drug him in the bedroom.
Okay. I need you to get out of the house. Did you drive over there?
Yes, I did.
What's your brother-in-law's name?
Huh?
What's your brother-in-law's name?
Yeah.
Ma'am?
Yeah.
What's his name?
Chris Rhoden and Gary Rhoden.
Chris and Gary Rhoden?
Both of them that looks like they're dead.
You think they're both dead?
I think they're both dead. Looks like someone has beat the fuck out of them.
Okay. Is there anybody else in the house?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
The door was locked when we got here, but I know where the key was at. And I went in, and they're laying on the floor.
Wait,
I'm done out. I'm
okay.
standing outside right now.
Okay. Just stay out of the house. Don't let anybody go in there, okay?
Yeah.
All right. We got deputies on the way, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
A short while later, before police arrived at the Union Hill residence following the 911 call, Bobby Joe entered the second separate home on Union Hill Road and discovered Frankie Rhoden and Hannah Gilley, both dead in their bed. Frankie and Hannah's 6-month-old child lay between them, unharmed. Their 4-year-old son, who had been sleeping on the sofa in the residence in a separate room, was also unharmed. Bobby Joe's brother, James Manley, then arrived and went to check in on the third residence on the Union Hill Road property and discovered the dead bodies of his sister Dana, her son Christopher, and her daughter Hannah Mae. Hannah had just had a child 4 days earlier. The child was lying next to her in the bed when Hannah was shot and was unharmed. Hannah also had a 2-year-old child who was not in the home at the time, but was with her biological father in another city. Unfortunately for poor Bobby Joe, due to the timeline of the 911 calls, she would become an immediate unofficial suspect and would be asked to take at least 2 polygraph tests, both which she passed. The second 911 call was made on April 22nd at 1:26 p.m. by Donald Stone, who, after hearing of the murders of the other family members on the news, went to check on his cousin, Kenneth Rhoden, who lived about 6 miles from the other properties on the Left Fork Road in Rhoden. When he entered the home, Donald discovered his cousin dead from gunshot wounds.
911. There's Pike County, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah.
This is 911. Can I help you?
Yeah, I need a deputy to come out to close to 799 Left Fork.
Okay.
It's all this stuff that's on the news. I just found my cousin with a gunshot wound.
Okay. Sir, is she alive?
No.
Okay. And you're at 799 Left Fork?
It's close to 799. I don't know what his address is. He don't have a box.
You don't have a box. Okay.
I'll be standing out by the road waiting on him.
Stone?
Yeah, I'm his cousin.
What's his name?
Kenneth Rhoden.
Kenneth Rhoden?
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Are you out of the house?
I'm out of the house right now. I just went in, hollering at him, and checked his all right, and I looked up at him. He had a gunshot wound.
Okay, sir. We're going to get deputies out there to you, okay?
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Police arrived on the properties, started to process the crime scenes, and began what came to be the largest investigation in Ohio history. Once law enforcement processed the scene and identified the victims, the cause of death for each of the victims was revealed, and it was astonishing. I'm going to break down the locations of the wounds for each of the victims. Christopher Rhoden Sr. was shot 9 times. He was possibly awake at the time of the murder, as there were signs of a struggle on his body. He was shot in his head, torso, and cheek, and he had defensive wounds to his right forearm that shattered bones, and he was believed to be among the first killed. There was at least one shot that went through a door before hitting him. Gary Rhoden, who was in the same property as Christopher Rhoden Sr., also had multiple gunshot wounds. Gary was shot 2 times in the head and 1 time in the face. In one of the shots, the gun was pressed against the side of his head so hard it left a muzzle stain. Dana Lynn Rhoden, the ex-wife of Christopher Rhoden, also had multiple gunshot wounds. She was in a separate property on the location, along with her son Christopher and her daughter Hannah. Dana was shot in the head and neck. She was shot 4 times on the right side of the head and 1 time under her chin. Christopher Rhoden Jr., the youngest of the victims at 16 years old, was shot multiple times in the head. Hannah Mae Rhoden, 19 years old, was shot 2 times in the head. Clarence Frankie Rhoden, who resided in a separate house along with his fiancée, Hannah Hazel Gilley, was shot multiple times in the head. Hannah Hazel Gilley, 20 years old, fiancée of Clarence Frankie Rhoden, was shot multiple times in the head, including 1 time to her left eye. Kenneth Rhoden, 44 years old, who resided in a property 6 miles away, died from a single gunshot through his right eye. Bruising was found on some of the bodies, indicating that some of the victims were awake at the time, or they struggled or were beaten by the assailants. An estimated total of 32 shots were fired, and it was confirmed that none of the victims committed suicide. It became obvious that this was nothing short of a planned-out execution of multiple people at multiple properties. Local and state law enforcement worked through the night on April 22nd, obtaining search warrants, gathering information from the remaining family members and community members, but were provided with no solid leads. They had no initial answers or suspects for the crime, and they wouldn't for the next 2 years. All they did know was that it appeared to be a pre-planned, calculated murder and that the family had been targeted. Meanwhile, in the small community of Pike County, residents were concerned for their families and wondered if there was a killer on the loose or if their family was next. Trying to create a sense of normalcy among the tragedy, Pike County continued to hold their annual Pike County Dogwood Festival the same month as the shootings, but it was obvious that the recent murders affected the community. Attendance was much smaller than normal that year, as the attendees couldn't help but ask each other if each had heard about the recent murders. 3 days following the murders, the Ohio Attorney General's office confirmed that marijuana plants were present at the Union Hill Road property and included an indoor grow house where an estimated 200 cannabis plants were grown, presumably for sale, not personal use, and cockfighting operations were present at some of the Rhoden properties. They didn't confirm any connection to this to the murders, but speculations arose as to the reasons why they would have been murdered, including links to drug cartels. When this information came out in the media, that was the consensus, that because there were drugs involved, that it had to be a crime related to the sale of narcotics. Pike County was no stranger to drug issues. In 2010, 22,000 cannabis plants were seized by authorities in Latham, 15 miles west of Piketon. And another cannabis growth site was found in 2012 and contained about 1,200 cannabis plants. In both cases, connections to the Mexican drug cartels were suspected. When interviewed by authorities, some family members of the Rhodens admitted that both Christopher Rhoden Sr. and Kenneth Rhoden grew cannabis, but of course stated that they were not aware of any high-volume growing operations. On April 28, the funeral for Gary Rhoden was the first to be held in South Shore, Kentucky. Hannah Hazel Gilley was next, with her services held on May 1st in Otway, Ohio. Funerals for the remaining victims took place on May 3rd at West Portsmouth with a high level of security. Many members of the community attended the funerals and memorial services. The Attorney General, Mike DeWine, approved more than $20,000 to help pay for the funerals of the victims. A reward of $10,000 was also authorized from the Southern Ohio Crime Stoppers Fund on May 10th, but due to a miscommunication and a misunderstanding about public notification, it was not announced by authorities until 10 weeks later on July 21st. There was also a reward offered up by a Cincinnati area businessman named Jeff Ruby, who offered $25,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in the shootings. But there was a concern if he would withdraw the reward due to the developments of the cannabis operations. Here's Jeff Ruby talking to Inside Edition about the reward.
Local restaurant owner Jeff Ruby is putting up a $25,000 reward for the capture of the killers. Stephen Fabian asked him about the marijuana connection.
Can you shed any light on that situation?
I don't know anything about it. Somebody tweeted me, are you still going to put the $25,000 if this was in drug involved? I didn't even bother responding to that tweet. Do we still want those people on the loose?
Strangely, following this interview and on April 28, 2016, Jeff Ruby withdrew his reward, citing recent complex criminal developments in the case in a post on Twitter. So maybe he had heard that someone in particular was being investigated. As police continued their investigation, the belief that more than one shooter was responsible began to surface. This belief came about because two of the properties were within walking distance of each other, the third was about a mile away, and the fourth property where Kenneth Rhoden was murdered was about 6 miles away. The fact that the shooters made efforts to cover up their tracks and not leave any forensic evidence indicated to law enforcement that this was a sophisticated and planned operation. As there were no suspects identified at the time, police didn't know if the suspects were still on the loose or if any other family members were also in danger. They told the surviving family members to take necessary precautions.
I advised them as their sheriff to be armed and to use caution because they were a target. It's evident.
This was an extremely large investigation. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation led a task force of about 100 members in the investigation. That, combined with law enforcement personnel, resulted in over 250 officials being involved in the case. Sheriffs from 25 offices across the state of Ohio also offered to provide their resources to Pike County. The FBI, of course, was also involved, as well as the Drug Enforcement Administration, and provided their expertise and advice to Ohio's Attorney General Mike DeWine, but did not take over the operation. At the initial stages of the investigation, more than 50 people were interviewed and at least 5 search warrants were executed. A total of 79 pieces of evidence were examined, and that included a Facebook threat to Christopher Rhoden Jr., which was posted on the social media site prior to the shootings. With no suspects identified and no leads, the investigators continued to gather multiple pieces of evidence, focusing mainly on the crime scenes and victims' properties. They towed several vehicles belonging to the Rhodens and collected more than 400 tips from the public, as well as held hundreds of interviews. On May 12th, the Attorney General and the Pike County Sheriff announced that they were going to relocate the mobile homes of the victims to a secure location to preserve evidence and protect the property of the Rhoden family. 6 months later, the mobile homes and personal property were returned to the victims' relatives on November 24, 2016. Let's talk about the surviving children. The 3 children that were spared and left unharmed during the shootings, which is unusual in itself because if it was a gang killing or a drug cartel murder, why would they leave the children unharmed? They have no moral compass. There's no compelling reason to leave any witness or really anyone alive at the locations, no matter what their age. So did the killers have a conscience? The children were 3-year-old Brentley Rhoden, son of Frankie Rhoden from another relationship, 6-month-old Ruger Rhoden, who was the son of Frankie Rhoden and Hannah Gilley, and 4-day-old Kylie Rhoden, who was the newborn daughter of Hannah Mae Rhoden. Following the death of their parents, both the 4-day-old and the 6-month-old were placed in protective services. 3-year-old Brentley is now in the custody of his biological mother, who was not involved or present during the shootings. 19-year-old victim Hannah Mae Rhoden's 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Wagner, who was luckily with her biological father, Edward Jake Wagner, Hannah's ex-boyfriend at the time of the shootings, was not harmed. Edward Jake Wagner, the 24-year-old biological father of Sophia Wagner, is the son of Angela and George Wagner III. Jake also has an older brother, George Wagner IV. Jake lived with his parents and brother and grew up in South Webster, Ohio, about 50 miles east from the Rhodens' property. We don't know much about how the relationship between the Rhodens and the Wagners began, but we do know that Jake Wagner and Hannah Mae Rhoden lived together at one time, during which they had Sophia, who was born in November of 2013. After a couple years, they eventually broke up in March of 2015. At the time Sophia was born, Jake worked on his family's farm. The Wagners were considered to be a good Christian family among community members and were known for their vast property holdings. Jake's grandmother, Frederica Wagner, has a 2,000-acre ranch in Lucasville, Ohio, called the Flying W Farm. If you want to check it out, it's www.flyingwfarms.com, which is known for breeding and selling miniature horses as well as a trademarked dog breed. The family also got into breeding miniature Vietnamese pot-bellied pigs. They like their miniatures, I guess. Reportedly worth anywhere from $1,000 to $20,000 apiece. On April 28th, 6 days following the murders, Jake Wagner filed a petition to the court asking for full custody of his daughter and was granted full custody in May of 2016. When the media questioned Jake and his mother, Angela Wagner, about this petition being filed so close after the murders, they insisted that there was no custody battle, but that they'd been working with a lawyer in the weeks prior to the murders to formalize a verbal, not a written, custody arrangement with Hannah Rhoden. Relatives of the Rhodens said that Jake Wagner and his father, George Wagner III, had argued and fought with the Rhodens in the weeks prior to the murders, trying to get custody of Sophia, but this was disputed by Jake Wagner. Jake said that he didn't go to Hannah's house prior to April 22nd and demand she sign over custody. He didn't want that, but rather wanted to continue the arranged shared custody agreement because it was working just fine. As this interaction between the Wagners and Rhodens was made apparent, this triggered a new direction in the investigation. It had been slightly over a year since the murders, with no arrests made, when in June 2017, Attorney General DeWine asked for the public's help to report any information that included business interactions with the Wagner family, specifically information regarding vehicles, firearms, and ammunition. At this point, the Wagners came out and claimed that they were now being publicly singled out and harassed. So what did they do? They sold their farm and moved to a remote part of Alaska, which, if you want to drop off the grid and disappear, it's pretty easy to do there. In part 2 of this series, we'll find out if the Wagners move off the grid, was to truly avoid harassment or if there was a darker motive at play. This wraps up episode 7, part 1 of the Pike County murders. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and rate the podcast on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to your podcasts so you can be sure to catch the next episode. Be sure to check out our website at www.thecrimeshack.com for the latest episodes and show notes. And be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Crime Shack Podcast and on Twitter at The Crime Shack.